Welcome, dear reader. If you have found your way here, I suspect you are the kind of person who still believes that a good mystery deserves a proper telling. Not the rushed kind. Not the kind that gives away its secrets in the first paragraph. The kind that sits with you. The kind where you turn the page not because you have to, but because you genuinely cannot stop yourself. Tonight, we have exactly that kind of story. It begins, as so many dark things do, in an alley. A dead man. No name, no family, no one to mourn him, just a beggar found cold in the London fog with a single coin resting over his eye. A foreign coin, mint condition, deliberately placed. Scotland Yard called it a robbery gone wrong. They were wrong. Sherlock Holmes called it something else entirely. He called it history catching up with a man who had spent years running from it. What follows is a story about disguise, about guilt, about the kind of past that does not stay buried no matter how deep you dig the grave. It is a story set in the fog and gaslight of London, 1902, and it is one of those cases that even Holmes himself did not find easy. There were moments, I can tell you now, where even he was not entirely sure where the truth was hiding. If you enjoy mysteries that breathe, that take their time and trust you to keep up, then you are in the right place. Settle in. The game, as my friend would say, is afoot. The body in the alley. It was the kind of morning that makes London feel like the inside of an old boot. Grey, damp, and vaguely unpleasant in a way you cannot quite name. I had arrived at Baker Street earlier than usual that Tuesday, the 14th of October, 1902, if my memory serves, owing to a particularly restless night and a breakfast that had done nothing to improve my mood. Mrs. Hudson had left a pot of tea on the table, and Holmes was already awake, which itself was unusual. He was standing at the window in his dressing gown, pipe in hand, staring down at the street below with the particular stillness he reserved for moments when his mind was doing something the rest of him had not caught up with yet. He did not turn when I entered. "You slept badly," he said. "Good morning to you too," I replied, pouring myself a cup. He finally turned, just slightly, and gave me one of those quick looks, the kind that lasted half a second and apparently told him everything. "Your left eye. Do you rub it when you have not slept? You have been rubbing it since you walked in." I had not even noticed I was doing it. I sat down and said nothing, which is usually the wisest response to Holmes in that particular mood. We sat in comfortable enough silence for perhaps 20 minutes. Holmes smoked. I drank my tea and read the first 3 pages of the morning paper without absorbing a single word. Outside, London went about its business. Cartwheels on wet cobblestones, someone shouting at a horse, the distant rhythm of the city that never quite goes quiet, even when it tries. Then came the knock. Not Mrs. Hudson's knock. Heavier, official. Holmes turned from the window before whoever it was had even finished knocking, and I saw something shift in his expression. Not excitement exactly, but a kind of attention, like a lamp being turned up slightly. Inspector Lestrade came in, looking the way Lestrade always looks when a case has already annoyed him before 9 in the morning. His coat was damp at the shoulders, his hat was in his hands, and he had the expression of a man who has been standing in a cold alley for longer than he would like, and has not yet had breakfast. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Watson." He nodded at us both and sat down without being invited, which told me he was tired. Lestrade always waited to be invited when he was feeling formal. "We have a body. Whitechapel. Alley off Goulston Street. Beggar by the look of him. Filthy clothes, no identification, nothing in his pockets worth mentioning. Cause of death? Holmes asked. He had not moved from the window. Blunt force, back of the skull, single blow, clean. Whoever did it knew what they were doing or got very lucky. Lestrade paused, turning his hat over in his hands. That is not why I am here, though. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Lestrade reached into his coat pocket and produced a small cloth envelope, the kind used for evidence. He set it on the table between us and opened it carefully. Inside was a coin. Copper, roughly the size of a shilling, but not a shilling. The face of it showed lettering I did not immediately recognize, and the metal had none of the dull wear you would expect from a coin that had been in regular use. It looked, in fact, almost new. Where was it found? Holmes asked. He had crossed the room without my noticing, and was now leaning over the table, studying the coin without touching it. Placed over his right eye, Lestrade said, deliberately, not dropped. I had not fallen. Placed. The position was too precise. There was a silence. I looked at the coin, then at Holmes. His expression had gone quite still in a way I recognized, the way a cat goes still when it has spotted something moving in the grass. And you came to me, Holmes said quietly, because Scotland Yard does not know what the coin is. Lestrade gave a short, somewhat reluctant nod. None of our men recognized it. We thought, yes, yes. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. Watson, your hat. Lestrade, take us there now. And please do not let anyone touch anything else before we arrive. I mean that quite seriously. I finished my tea in 2 large swallows, which was not ideal, and followed them both down the stairs and out into the grey London morning. And the alley off Goulston Street was narrow, and smelled the way such places always smell. Damp stone, old refuse, the particular staleness of a place the sun has not visited in some time. 2 uniformed constables stood at the entrance, and a small cluster of locals had gathered a little further back, doing what Londoners always do at scenes of misfortune, which is to say they were watching with great interest, while pretending they were simply passing through. The body was still where it had been found. The dead man was lying on his back, which Lestrade told us was how the constable who discovered him had turned him over. Originally, he had been face down. He was dressed in the clothes of a street beggar, heavy, rough coat, worn trousers, boots with the soles coming away at the front. His face, beneath a week's worth of grey stubble, he was, and this struck me even before Holmes said anything, not quite what you expected. I am a doctor. I have seen a great many faces in my time, and there is a quality to long-term poverty that leaves its mark in specific ways. The texture of the skin, the condition of the teeth, the particular hollowness around the eyes that comes from years of poor nutrition. This man had none of that. His hands, when I looked at them, were rough on the surface, deliberately roughed, I began to think, but the bone structure beneath was fine. The nails had been torn and dirtied, but were not the nails of a man who had lived hard for years. His face had been aged artificially, I was nearly certain of it. Some mixture applied to the skin. A practiced slouch, perhaps, to disguise posture. Holmes was crouched beside the body, studying the area around the right eye where the coin had been. The coin itself had been taken away. Lestrade had it, but the placement had apparently been on the closed lid. Closed? Holmes murmured to himself. The eye was closed when the coin was placed. That is not incidental. What does it mean? I asked. He did not answer immediately. He was looking at the man's coat, running his fingers along the inner lining near the collar without opening it. Then he stopped, looked up at Lestrade and said, "Has this coat been searched properly, the lining?" Lestrade frowned. "The pockets were checked. "The lining," Holmes repeated with the patience of a man who has said the same thing many times before. One of the constables produced a small knife and carefully opened a section of the inner lining near the left shoulder. Inside, stitched into the cloth, was a small flat object, a piece of paper, folded very small and wrapped in a strip of waxed cloth to protect it from moisture. Holmes unfolded it with great care. It was a name, not the dead man's name as it turned out. No, the paper contained a single line of writing in a small, precise hand. Not an address, not a message, just a name, and beneath it, a date. Holmes read it, folded it again, and placed it in his breast pocket. His expression, in that moment, was one I had not seen very often. Not quite troubled, not quite surprised, something between the two. "Well?" Lestrade asked. "Interesting," Holmes said, standing up and brushing the knees of his trousers. "Very interesting. I will need 2 days, Lestrade, possibly 3. Can you tell me anything now?" Holmes looked down at the body once more. "I can tell you that this man was not a beggar. I can tell you that he had been hiding, successfully, for what I suspect was a considerable number of years, and that whoever killed him had been looking for a very long time." He paused. "I can also tell you that the coin will tell us more than the body. That is where we begin." He turned and walked back toward the alley entrance, stepping around a puddle with the automatic precision of a man whose mind is already somewhere else entirely. I looked at Lestrade. Lestrade looked at me. "Does he ever just say good morning and leave it at that?" Lestrade asked. "Not in my experience," I said, and followed Holmes out into the street. The coin that should not exist. Back at Baker Street, Holmes did not speak for a long time. This was not unusual, and there are 2 kinds of Holmes silences, and I had learned, over the years, to tell them apart. The first kind is the silence of a man who has nothing to say. The second kind, the one that fills a room differently, that has a texture to it almost, is the silence of a man whose mind is moving so fast that speech would only slow it down. That second kind has a particular quality to it. You can feel it, the way you can feel a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. This was the second kind. He had placed the coin on the table under the good lamp, the one he reserved for close examination, and he was bent over it with his magnifying lens, turning it very slowly between 2 fingers, examining each face, and then the edge, then the face again. I had poured myself a fresh cup of tea and settled into my chair with the intention of reading, but I found I could not concentrate. I kept watching him instead. The coin sat on a square of white cloth. Even from across the room, I could see it was not British. The lettering on the face was not English, and the symbols were not anything I could immediately place. The copper was clean and bright in a way that seemed wrong for a coin found in a Whitechapel alley. It looked like something that had spent its life in a drawer, or a box, or a pocket, kept, deliberately kept by someone who considered it worth keeping. After perhaps half an hour, Holmes straightened up. He did not say anything immediately. He crossed to his bookshelf, the organized chaos of the middle section, the one that held the reference volumes and the thick, cross-indexed notebooks he had compiled himself over years, and began pulling things out. A broad atlas, a volume on colonial currencies. One of his own notebooks, black-covered and dense with his small handwriting. He brought them all to the table and began moving between them with the quick, unhurried efficiency that always reminded me of a man who knows exactly where everything is, even when no one else could find anything. I watched for a while, and then gave up pretending I was going to read. "Can you tell me anything about it yet?" I asked. Holmes looked up briefly. Several things. Whether they are the right things remains to be seen. He set down the lens and sat back. The coin is copper, as you can see. The weight is wrong for British currency, slightly heavier. The lettering on the obverse is not English, not French, not Dutch. The script is a regional variant, I am nearly certain, of a style used in specific parts of the Indian subcontinent during the mid to latter half of the last century, colonial period. The imagery on the reverse. He turned the coin over and held it under the lamp again. Is a regimental symbol, or was. It has been partially worn down on one edge, but deliberately so. Someone rubbed that edge specifically. The rest of the coin is untouched. Why would someone do that? To remove identification while preserving the coin's meaning, Holmes said. He set it down. Whoever kept this coin kept it for a reason that had nothing to do with its monetary value. It is worth, I would estimate, almost nothing as currency. As a symbol, that is a different matter entirely. He opened the volume on colonial currencies and began turning pages. Yo came and stood beside him, looking over his shoulder. The pages were dense with illustrations of coins from various corners of the empire, thick, careful engravings of both faces, with descriptions of weight, composition, and regional origin printed beneath in small type. Holmes moved through them with a practiced eye, pausing occasionally, moving on. He stopped. The coin in the illustration was not identical to the one on our table, but it was close, very close. The shape of the lettering, the general composition of the reverse side, the similarities were obvious even to me. Holmes read the description beneath it quietly, half to himself. Regional Commemorative Issue, Bengal, circa 1857. He looked up. Watson? Yes. He looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read. 1857? It took me a moment, and then it did not take me a moment anymore. The Indian Mutiny, I should say, for the benefit of those who may not have the history immediately to hand, that 1857 was not simply a year. In the long and complicated story of the British presence in India, it was something closer to a wound. One of those events that people who lived through it, on either side, did not discuss lightly and did not forget. The uprising of the Indian sepoys against the East India Company. The sieges, the reprisals, the things done and the things that could not be undone. It had ended, as such things tend to end, with the stronger party winning and the accounting of costs being quietly set aside in favor of moving forward. But history has a long memory, even when the people who made it would prefer otherwise. Holmes said nothing of this. He did not need to. He simply looked at the coin for another long moment and then said, I need to know more about the specific region. This is not a general issue. It is local, which means it is tied to a specific event, or a specific regiment, or both. Where do we look? The records, he said, the military archives, and, he paused, tapping the coin lightly with one finger, I know someone. The someone turned out to be a retired gentleman named Horace Pemberton, who lived in a first-floor flat in Bloomsbury, and had spent 31 years in the Indian Civil Service before his knees gave out, and his doctor ordered him back to England. Holmes had apparently done something for Pemberton some years before. He was vague on the details, which usually meant the matter had been delicate, and Pemberton had since made himself useful as an occasional source of knowledge about things Indian that did not appear in any standard reference volume. We arrived at his flat that afternoon. Pemberton was a broad, slow-moving man in his late 60s, with white hair, and the deeply weathered face of someone who had spent decades in a climate that English skin was not designed for. He received us in a sitting room that was so thoroughly colonized by Indian objects. Brass figures, folded silk, framed maps, a mounted photograph of a distant fort, that stepping into it felt faintly like stepping into another country. And he poured us tea without asking whether we wanted it, and then sat back and looked at the coin Holmes placed before him, with the expression of a man who has been shown something he was not expecting. He did not speak for almost a full minute. "Where did you find this?" he said finally. "It was found near a body," Holmes said. "A dead man in Whitechapel, placed deliberately." Pemberton looked up. His expression was difficult to name. Not quite shock. Something more like a very old, very tired recognition. "Placed over the eye," he said. Holmes went very still. "I did not tell you that." "No," Pemberton agreed. He set the coin down on the arm of his chair and looked out the window at the grey Bloomsbury Street for a moment. "No, you did not, Mr. Pemberton," Holmes said carefully. "I would very much appreciate it if you would tell me what you know." The old man was quiet for another few seconds. Then he sighed, a long, slow exhalation that seemed to come from somewhere deep and tired. "I know what the coin is," he said. "I did not think I would ever see one again. There were not many made, and I thought most of them were gone. What are they?" Pemberton looked at the coin once more. "They were made in 1857. Not officially, nothing like that. Made by the men themselves, a particular regiment, the 14th Bengal Infantry. They were stationed at a garrison near a place called Mirabad. Small post, mostly forgotten even then." He paused. "When the mutiny came, the situation there was complicated. There were men on both sides who did things, as there always are." He stopped again. Holmes waited. He was very good at waiting when waiting was what was needed. "The coins were made by a group of officers," Pemberton continued slowly. 6 of them. A kind of pact, you might say. A record of something they had done together. Something that was never reported, never put in any official account. He folded his hands in his lap. "I knew one of those men. Slightly. Enough to know that he spent the rest of his life not sleeping well." "What did they do?" I asked. Pemberton looked at me. "They gave an order," he said simply. "An order that should not have been given. To a unit of Indian soldiers under their command. Non-combatants mostly, men who had not taken part in the uprising. The order," he stopped, pressed his lips together. "The order was carried out. And the men who gave it made those coins to remember it by. God knows why. Guilt, perhaps, or pride. It is sometimes difficult to tell the difference." The room was very quiet. Outside, a cart went by on the street below. "How many coins were there?" Holmes asked. 6, Pemberton said. 1 for each officer." Holmes nodded slowly. He reached out and picked up the coin from the arm of Pemberton's chair. He turned it over once in his fingers, looked at the reverse, the partially worn edge, the regimental symbol that was and was not quite there anymore. "Then," he said quietly, almost to himself, "we are looking for a 7th man." Pemberton looked at him sharply. "The man who remembered what those 6 did," Holmes said, "and has been waiting for, 45 years, to make certain they did not forget it either." Pemberton stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded, and in his eyes there was something that was not quite sorrow, and not quite relief, but was perhaps the particular feeling of a secret that has been kept too long finally beginning to move towards the light. We left Pemberton's flat as the afternoon was tipping toward evening, the sky over Bloomsbury going from grey to the deeper, inkier grey that precedes London dark. Holmes walked with his hands deep in his coat pockets and his chin slightly down. His thinking posture, I had always called it privately, and said almost nothing for 2 full streets. Then he said, without looking up, the dead man was one of the 6. You are certain? The coin placed over his eye was his own coin, returned to him. That is not the act of a stranger or a common criminal. That is a message. Someone is returning to each of these men what they made, and what they did. And the others, I asked, the other 5 officers. Holmes looked up then, and there was something in his expression that was, I will admit it, unsettling. Not fear. Holmes did not do fear, precisely, but something adjacent to urgency that I did not often see in him. That, he said, is exactly the right question, and I am not certain we have a great deal of time in which to answer it. He raised his hand for a cab, and we rode back to Baker Street in the kind of silence that is not comfortable at all. The archives of a forgotten war. The next morning, Holmes was gone before I came downstairs. This was not entirely unusual, but it was always slightly disorienting. To come down and find the chair empty, the pipe on the table, or the room carrying the particular quality of a space that was recently occupied and is now not. Mrs. Hudson informed me he had left at 6:30, which meant he had barely slept. There was a note on the table, written in his quick, slightly impatient hand. Watson, gone to the War Office. Do not wait. Eat something. Back by afternoon, possibly evening. Do not let Lestrade in if he comes. Tell him Tuesday. It was not Tuesday. It was Thursday. I was fairly certain Holmes knew that. I ate breakfast alone, read the paper properly this time, and spent the morning writing up some patient notes I had been neglecting. But I will be honest, I did not concentrate particularly well. The case had settled into my mind in the way certain cases do, not with noise, but with a kind of persistent low weight. A beggar who was not a beggar, and a coin that was not currency. A secret from 1857 that had apparently followed its keepers across half a century and several thousand miles, and arrived finally in a Whitechapel alley on a grey October morning. History, Holmes had said in the cab the previous evening, and then stopped, which was not like him. I had asked him to finish the thought. He had looked out the cab window and said, I was going to say something rather obvious. Never mind. Holmes almost never said never mind. It meant the thought was not obvious at all, and he was not yet ready to put it into words. He returned at 4:15 in the afternoon carrying a leather satchel that had not left with him in the morning, which meant he had acquired it along the way, which meant the War Office visit had been productive enough to generate physical material he needed to bring home. He came in without a word, dropped the satchel on the table, removed his coat, and stood in the middle of the room for a moment with the slightly unfocused look of a man mentally sorting through a large number of things at once. Sit down, I said, because sometimes with Holmes you simply had to say it. He sat. I pushed the tea toward him. He drank it without appearing to notice he was doing so. The War Office, he said finally, is staffed largely by men who do not enjoy being asked questions. However, there is a particular clerk in the Records Division, a Mr. Afoot, small man, reddish beard. I've been there since approximately the Crimean period by the look of him, who has an almost religious devotion to filing systems, and was deeply offended that records pertaining to the 14th Bengal Infantry were not in better order. Holmes paused. I may have told him they were excellent. He became quite forthcoming. What did you find? Holmes opened the satchel and drew out a collection of papers. Some originals, some clearly copied by hand in Holmes's own writing, a few that appeared to be official documents with the War Office seal. He spread them on the table with the practiced organization of a man who had already spent time sorting them mentally on the journey home. "The 14th Bengal Infantry," he said, settling back. "Stationed at Mirabad Garrison, 1856 to 1858. During the mutiny, the garrison was under the command of a lieutenant colonel named Edward Harcastle." He tapped one of the papers. "Harcastle is dead. 1889, natural causes, Kent. I checked." He moved to another paper. "Of the 6 officers Pemberton described, I have identified 5 with reasonable certainty from the records. Their names, their subsequent careers, their current status." "And the 6th? "The 6th, Holmes said, "is the interesting one." He picked up a single sheet and held it. There was a captain among the group, a man named in the regimental records as Arthur Vane. He appears in the records clearly up to July of 1857. After that, Holmes set the paper down. Nothing. No further service record. No pension record. No death record. At least none I have found. No marriage record. No property records. He simply stops. He disappeared. He disappeared, Holmes agreed, which could mean several things. It could mean he died in the field, and the record was lost, not uncommon in that period. It could mean he changed his name. It could mean he paused, and I saw something shift in his expression. It could mean that he was the one who decided at some point after July 1857 that he could not live with what he had been part of, and that he chose to become someone else. I looked at the papers on the table. "You think the dead man is Arthur Vane?" "I think it is very possible." Holmes picked up the coin from where it had been sitting in its cloth square at the edge of the table. The note found sewn into his coat lining, the name written on it, was not his own name. It was a name I did not recognize when I first read it. I have since found that name in the regimental records. He set the coin down. It was the name of the Indian officer who commanded the unit at Mirabad, the unit that received the order. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a bus rumbled past on Baker Street, and someone below was talking in the street, their voice rising and falling without the words being audible. "He carried the name of the man he wronged," I said, "sewn into his coat. For how long, I cannot say. Years, certainly, perhaps decades." Holmes was quiet for a moment, looking at the coin. "It is not nothing, Watson. A man who has spent years in disguise, living as no one, carrying a dead man's name next to his skin. That is not simply guilt. That is something more considered than guilt." "Penance," I said. Holmes looked at me. Or perhaps. He did not seem entirely comfortable with the word, which surprised me slightly. Holmes was not usually uncomfortable with words. "What about the others?" I asked, pulling my thoughts back to the practical. "The other 5 officers, you said you found them. 4 of them are dead." He indicated 4 of the papers in sequence. Harcastle, as I said, 1889. A Major Fenn, 1893, Edinburgh. A Captain Bryson, 1897, he drowned, accident on record. A Lieutenant Osgood, 1901, influenza. He paused. That leaves 1 living officer. A man named Colonel Simon Rawlins, retired. He is currently residing at his estate in Wiltshire. He is 73 years old. He is in danger. He is potentially the last one, Holmes said. If someone is working through the list, and the placement of Vane's own coin over his eyes suggests precisely that kind of deliberate sequential intention, then Rawlins is next, or may have already been visited. He stood abruptly, with the sudden energy that sometimes comes on him after long periods of stillness. "I have sent a telegram to the Wiltshire police, asking them to make a discreet check. I expect a reply this evening. And if Rawlins is unharmed, then we go to Wiltshire," Holmes said simply. He moved to the window, looked out. "There is also the matter of who is doing this. The seventh man, as I called him at Pemberton's. Whoever it is, they have information about these men. Their real names, their current identities, their locations, that took considerable effort to compile. This is not impulse. This is a project. It's something that has been built up carefully over a very long time." "A survivor of Mirabad," I said. "Or a descendant," Holmes said. 1857 was 45 years ago. The men who were wronged at Mirabad, if they survived, would be very old now. Their children would not. He turned from the window. "We are not necessarily looking for an old man, Watson. We may be looking for someone who inherited a story and decided at some point that the story required an ending." He said it matter-of-factly, in the way he said most things. But there was something in the last sentence that sat in the room differently from the rest. I did not say anything for a moment. "Do you think it is justified?" I asked finally. I'm not entirely sure why I asked it. Perhaps because the case had been sitting in me all day in that low, weighted way. Holmes looked at me with an expression I could not quite read. "I think," he said carefully, after a pause that was long enough to be unusual for him, "that justified is a word people use when they mean something they cannot quite bring themselves to say directly." He picked up his pipe. "I think what happened at Mirabad in 1857 was—" He stopped, started again. "I think there are things on record and things not on record, and the distance between them is sometimes very wide." It was not an answer, but it was more of one than I had expected from him, and I found I did not press further. The telegram from Wiltshire arrived at 7 that evening. Colonel Simon Rawlins was alive. He was also, the telegram noted, in a considerable state of agitation. He had found something on his doorstep that morning that he refused to describe to the local constable over the telephone. He had, however, asked 3 times whether there was anyone from London who could come. Holmes read the telegram, folded it, and looked at me. "Morning train," he said. "I'll pack tonight," I said, the man who was never poor. The morning train to Wiltshire left Paddington at 7:40 and arrived, after a journey that was scenic, in the way English countryside in October is scenic, which is to say grey and damp and quietly beautiful in a manner that requires a certain mood to appreciate. At a small station called Ashford Crossing at approximately 10:15. Holmes spent most of the journey reading, or appearing to read, a thin volume he had brought from the shelf at Baker Street the previous evening. I say appearing because I noticed twice that he had not turned a page in 20 minutes. He was thinking. He was using the book the way some men use a cigarette, not for what it was, but for something to do with his hands while his mind went somewhere else. I looked out the window and let him be. A trap had been arranged by the local constable, a young man named Hodges who met us at the station, with the combination of deference and barely concealed curiosity that junior policemen tend to display when Holmes arrives anywhere. He was polite, he was efficient, and he told us on the journey to the Rawlins estate that the colonel had not slept the previous night, that his housekeeper was worried about him, and that the object found on the doorstep had been brought inside and was sitting on the colonel's desk under a handkerchief. where the Colonel had apparently insisted it remain until someone from London arrived to see it in its original condition. He said he knew what it was, Hodges told us, managing the reins with one hand and glancing back at Holmes as when he found it. He said, and this is his exact words, sir, because they struck me as odd, he said, "I have been waiting for this for 20 years." Holmes said nothing. He was looking at the road ahead. 20 years, I said, not 45. That is what he said, sir. Holmes turned to look at me then, briefly. Something in his expression that might have been interest-sharpening. He said nothing and turned back to the road. But the Rawlins estate was not grand in the way certain Wiltshire estates are grand. No long avenue of trees, no imposing facade designed to make you feel small as you approached. It was a solid, well-maintained manor house of moderate size, the kind built for comfort rather than impression, with good stone walls and a garden that had been properly kept and was now settling into its autumn state with a certain dignified untidiness. The kind of house that says its owner was never trying to prove anything. Colonel Simon Rawlins met us in his study. He was a tall man, or had been. Age had compressed him slightly, rounded the shoulders, softened the military straightness he must once have carried. He was 73, as Holmes had said, but with white hair cropped close, and a face that was deeply lined in the particular way of men who have spent long periods outdoors in difficult climates. His eyes were sharp, though. Whatever the rest of him had conceded to age, his eyes had not. They were pale grey and very direct, and when they settled on Holmes, they did so with the assessing steadiness of a man who has spent his life making quick judgments about people and has not yet stopped. He shook Holmes's hand and mine, indicated chairs, and sat behind his desk without preamble. "You will want to see it," he said. It was not a question. He reached across the desk and lifted the handkerchief. Beneath it was a coin. Copper, mint condition. Identical in every visible respect to the one found over the dead man's eye in Whitechapel. Holmes leaned forward and examined it without touching it. His face showed nothing in particular, which meant he was being careful. "It was on your doorstep," he said. "When?" "Yesterday morning, before 6. My housekeeper found it when she went out for the milk. It was placed..." Rawlins paused and something passed across his face. It was placed on the top step, directly in the center. On a small square of dark cloth, as if presented. "Not simply left," Holmes said. "Presented." "Yes." Rawlins folded his hands on the desk. They were steady. I noticed that. A man of 73 who has been told, in effect, that someone knows where he lives and wishes him to know it, and his hands were perfectly steady. I knew what it was the moment I saw it. I recognized it immediately. "You made it," Holmes said. "I helped make it," Rawlins said. His voice was even. There were 6 of us. We had them made by a local craftsman in Mirabad. After, he stopped, resumed. After what happened, I do not know whose idea it was originally. Perhaps no one's exactly. It seemed important at the time that there be a record of some kind, even if only among ourselves, and that we not pretend it had not happened. And yet, Holmes said quietly, it was never officially reported. Rawlins looked at him steadily. No, it was not. The room was quiet. A clock on the mantelpiece ticked. Outside the window, a crow crossed the grey sky and disappeared behind the tree line. "Colonel Rawlins," Holmes said, "a man was found dead in Whitechapel 3 days ago. A beggar to all appearances. He was not a beggar. We believe he was Captain Arthur Vane, formerly of the 14th Bengal Infantry. A coin identical to this one was placed over his right eye after his death. something moved in Rawlins's face. Not surprise. The surprise I thought had happened some time ago. This was something older and more settled. "Arthur," he said quietly, almost to himself. He was silent for a moment. I wondered sometimes where he had gone, whether he stopped. He disappeared in 1857. None of us knew what became of him. I assumed he was dead. I assumed it for a long time. He looked at the coin on the desk. How long had he been living that way? "We do not know precisely," Holmes said. "Years, certainly. He was in disguise, very thorough disguise. A doctor might not have caught it without looking carefully." I said from my chair, "He was not living as a poor man from necessity. It appeared deliberate." Rawlins absorbed this. "Yes," he said after a moment, "that would be Arthur. He was, of all of us, he felt it most, even at the time. He was the only one who said directly, in those words, that what we had done was wrong." He paused. "The rest of us found other words for it, more comfortable ones." Holmes leaned back slightly. "The other 4 officers, Harcastle, Fenn, Bryson, Osgood, are dead. Natural causes and 1 accident, across a period of years. I want to ask you directly, Colonel, because we do not have time for careful approaches. Do you believe any of those deaths were natural?" Rawlins looked at him for a long time. "Bryson," he said finally. "He drowned. 1897. He was a strong swimmer. I was at his club not 2 months before, and he mentioned, quite casually, that he had received a letter. Anonymous. He did not tell me what it said. He made light of it, but he was not a man who made light of things lightly, if you understand me. I thought about it when I heard he had drowned." He paused. "I have thought about it a number of times since." "And the others? Did any of them mention unusual letters, unusual incidents? Osgood said something once, in 1899, I think. He said someone had been asking questions about him at his club, asking about India. He was uncomfortable about it, but Osgood was an uncomfortable man generally, and I did not." Rawlins stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. I did not take it as seriously as perhaps I ought to have done. Holmes nodded. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the coin on the desk. Then he said, "Mr. Pemberton, do you know that name?" "Horace Pemberton, yes. He was in the civil service. I met him twice, I believe, in India. We were not close. He knew about the coins. He knew they existed, and he knew what they signified." Rawlins frowned slightly. "Pemberton knew? How?" "He said he knew one of the 6 men. Slightly. I did not press him on which one." Holmes paused. "I should have." It was said simply without drama. But it was, I realized, Holmes admitting he had missed something, which he did not do often, and when he did, it was always worth paying attention to. "It is also possible," Holmes continued, "that Pemberton is not relevant beyond what he told us. But I find I would like to know more about how he came to know." He stood, moved to the window, and looked out at the garden. A long moment passed. "Colonel Rawlins," he said, without turning around, "whoever is doing this has known where these men were for some time. They have been patient, very patient. The question I cannot yet answer is whether the intention is to kill you or only to," he paused, searching for the word, "inform you. The coin on your doorstep is a message that says, I know who you are and I know what you did. Whether it is also a prelude to something else, I am not yet certain." "I am not afraid of dying," Rawlins said. He said it plainly, not as a performance. "I know," Holmes said. He turned from the window. "That is not what concerns me. What concerns me is that whoever this is, they are still out there, and they are clearly not finished. Vane is dead. You are alive, for now, and aware, which means he looked at Rawlins directly. Whoever comes next knows that you have been warned. And a warned man changes the conditions. You want to use me? Rawlins said. Not with accusation, almost with something like faint approval. I want to stay, Holmes said. Both of us. Here, tonight, and however many nights are necessary. I want to let whoever is watching this house, and I believe someone is or has been, draw their own conclusions about what a detective and a doctor arriving from London means. And then I want to see what they do about it. Rawlins looked at him steadily. Then he looked at me. Then back at Holmes. Mrs. Alcott makes an excellent lamb stew, he said. I will have rooms prepared. That evening after supper, the lamb stew was indeed excellent, though none of us ate with full attention. Holmes and I sat with Rawlins in his study, and he talked. Holmes had not specifically asked him to. He had simply settled into his chair with his pipe and his particular quality of open patient attention, and Rawlins had begun, slowly, the way a man begins who has wanted for a long time to say something, and has not previously had either the occasion or the permission. He talked about Mirabad. He talked about the summer of 1857, and the fear that moved through every British garrison in India that year like weather, invisible but felt inescapable. He talked about the morning the order was given and the afternoon it was carried out, and the evening after, which he said was the longest evening he had ever lived through and the one he returned to most often in dreams. He did not make excuses. That was what I noticed most, I think. He had had 45 years to construct a version of events that made it more bearable, and either he had chosen not to, or he had tried, and it had not worked. What he said was plain, and he said it plainly, and the plainness of it was worse, somehow, than if he had dressed it up. Holmes listened without speaking. His pipe went out, and he did not relight it. When Rawlins finally stopped talking, the room was very quiet. The clock on the mantelpiece said it was nearly 11. Thank you, Holmes said. That was all. Rawlins nodded. He looked, I thought, slightly lighter. Not happy, not relieved exactly, just very slightly lighter. The way a man looks when he has put something down that he has been carrying for a long time. We went to our rooms shortly after. I lay in the dark and listened to the Wiltshire quiet, which is a different quiet from London, deeper, more thorough, and thought about a man carrying a dead man's name sewn into his coat lining. For God knows how many years, living as no one in a Whitechapel alley, and whether that was penance or punishment, and whether there was really a difference. I did not sleep particularly well. Down the hall, I could see lamplight under Holmes's door until nearly 2 in the morning. The survivor's shadow. I woke at 5:30 to the sound of Holmes's door. Not closing, opening. The particular sound of a door being opened very carefully by someone who does not want to wake the house but is not quite careful enough, which in Holmes's case usually meant he was moving quickly and patience was losing to urgency. I lay still for a moment, listening. Footsteps in the corridor, unhurried but purposeful, heading towards the stairs. I got up. By the time I had dressed and come downstairs, Holmes was already in the entrance hall, coat on, standing at the front door, which he had opened perhaps 3 inches, and was looking through into the grey pre-dawn dark of the garden. He heard me on the stairs and held up one hand without turning, the gesture that means stay there and be quiet, which I have learned over the years to take seriously. I stayed. I was quiet. After perhaps 2 minutes, he eased the door closed, turned, and looked at me. His expression was the focused, stripped-back look he gets when something is happening that requires all of him, and there is no spare capacity for anything else. Someone was in the garden, he said very low, near the east wall. They are gone now, but not long gone. The gate latch is still moving." "You saw them?" "I saw movement." "Enough." He was already moving toward the back of the house. "Wake Rawlins, quietly. Tell him to stay inside, and tell his housekeeper the same. Do not wake Hodges yet." "Holmes, I'm going to follow," he said, simply. As if it were obvious, which I supposed it was. "Alone," I said. He paused at the kitchen door and looked back at me with an expression that was almost, not quite but almost, apologetic. "You would make more noise than I need right now, Watson. I am sorry. Wake Rawlins." And then he was gone, out through the kitchen into the back garden, moving with that particular swift quietness that always slightly astonished me in a man of his height and build. I stood in the entrance hall for a moment, feeling the familiar combination of concern and irritation that Holmes produced in me on a fairly regular basis, and then went upstairs to wake the Colonel. Rawlins took the news with the composure of a man who had made his peace with most things. He dressed quickly, came downstairs, and positioned himself in the study with the calm practicality of someone who had spent a military career waiting in uncertain situations. He did not ask anxious questions. He made tea, which I thought was admirable. We waited. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The sky outside began its slow movement from black to the deep grey of very early morning. A bird started somewhere in the garden, one of those single, tentative notes that seems to ask whether it is really time yet. At 40 minutes, I was beginning to feel the particular kind of worry that comes when Holmes has been gone longer than the situation seemed to require. At 45 minutes, the kitchen door opened and he came back. He was not physically harmed, which was the first thing I checked. His coat had a fresh tear at the left sleeve, and there was mud on both knees and one side of his coat, which meant he had been down on the ground at some point, either by choice or otherwise. His expression was difficult to read, not the clean, sharp focus of a man who has just solved something, but something more complicated, more layered. He sat down at the kitchen table without being asked and accepted the tea Rawlins placed in front of him. "Tell me," I said. Holmes wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment before speaking. "I followed the trail from the gate east along the lane for approximately a quarter mile. Whoever it was knew the ground. They moved fast and they moved well, better than I expected." He paused. "I lost them at the crossroads. There were too many directions and not enough light. By the time I had identified which way, he stopped, and something in his expression tightened briefly, then released. I was too late. I found where they had been standing, watching the house. For some time, I think. The grass was flattened in a specific way, patient observation. But you saw something, I said, because something had happened out there beyond simply losing a trail. I could see it in him." Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "At the crossroads, just before I lost them. There was enough light, just enough, to see the figure turning down the south lane." He paused again. It was not a large man. Not young, I think, but not elderly either. And there was something, the way they moved. Something I recognized. "Recognized," Rawlins said sharply from across the kitchen. "You know who it is." "Not know," Holmes said carefully. "I have seen that way of moving before, recently." He looked at his tea. "I cannot place it yet, which is—" He paused, and what came across his face was something I would not normally associate with Holmes. Something brief and unguarded, irritating. He said the word with enough feeling that it was clearly an understatement. "It will come," I said. "It will come," he agreed without great confidence. He drank his tea. After breakfast, which Rawlins's housekeeper, Mrs. E. Alcott, produced with the determined normality of a woman who has decided that unusual circumstances are no excuse for a poor table. Holmes spent the better part of 2 hours in a state of concentrated stillness in the study armchair that an outside observer might have mistaken for sleep. It was not sleep. I had seen Holmes sleep, and it looked nothing like this. This was the particular quality of deep internal motion that produced eventually either a conclusion or a cigarette, and sometimes both. Rawlins read. I wrote letters I had been meaning to write for weeks. Mrs. Alcott could be heard in the kitchen with the solid, reassuring sounds of domestic industry. At 10:30, Holmes opened his eyes and said without preamble, "Pemberton." I looked up from my letter. "Oh, what about him?" The way the figure moved at the crossroads. He sat forward. Pemberton walks with a very slight turn to the left on the right foot. An old injury, I thought when I saw it, or a structural irregularity. I noticed it when we were at his flat and did not register it as significant. I registered it now. He was on his feet. The figure at the crossroads had the same characteristic, the same turn, the same. He paused, shaking his head slightly as if clearing it. It was dark and I may be wrong, but I do not think I am wrong. "Pemberton," I said again slowly. He knew about the coins. He knew they were placed over the eye before you told him. "Yes. You said you should have pressed him on that." "I did say that." Holmes was moving now, toward the writing desk in the corner. "I need to send a telegram to Mrs. Hudson. I need her to go to Pemberton's flat, today, now, if possible." "You think he is involved?" Rawlins said from his chair. He had set his book down and was watching Holmes with those sharp, pale eyes. "Horace Pemberton." "I think," Holmes said, writing quickly, "that Horace Pemberton knew a great deal more than he told us. I think his knowledge of the coin and the placement was not second-hand. I think the man he said he knew slightly, one of the 6 officers, was perhaps known rather less slightly than he claimed." He folded the telegram and looked up. "And I think the 31 years he spent in the Indian Civil Service gave him access to exactly the kind of records that would allow a patient man to locate 6 officers who had spent decades hoping to be forgotten." "But why?" I asked. What is Pemberton's connection to Mirabad?" Holmes looked at me steadily. "That is what I do not yet know, and it is the piece that matters most." He turned to Rawlins. "Colonel, the man who commanded the Indian unit at Mirabad, the man whose name was written on the paper in Vane's coat. You knew him." "I knew of him," Rawlins said carefully. "His name was Maharaj Singh. He commanded a unit of irregular cavalry. He was not part of the uprising. He was trying to hold his men together and keep the peace." He stopped. "He did not survive. He had family." "Most men do," Rawlins said quietly. Holmes was already at the desk. "Hodges," he said, not loudly but with a carrying quality, and the young constable appeared from the hallway where he had been stationed since morning with admirable patience. "I need this telegram sent from the village immediately, and I need you to make an inquiry, through whatever channels you have available, about a man named Horace Pemberton, formerly of the Indian Civil Service, currently residing in Bloomsbury. Any records of his time in India? Any family connections? He paused, any connection to a name? Maharaj Singh, 14th Bengal Infantry, 1857. Hodges took the telegram and the note Holmes had written, and left at something close to a trot. Holmes turned back to the room. He stood for a moment in the center of the study, not quite still. There was a quality of movement in him even when he was physically stationary on days like this, and then he said, "We wait, and we watch the house tonight." "You think they will come back?" I said. "I think," Holmes said, that whoever was in that garden this morning came to look, to see whether the arrival of a detective from London had changed the situation. When they have decided what it means, he looked toward the window, the garden, the east wall. They will come back, yes. He said it with certainty. But there was something else beneath the certainty, something I had been noticing since he returned from the crossroads, since he had sat at the kitchen table with both hands around his cup with the slightly unguarded look of a man who had not expected to feel what he was feeling. I waited until Rawlins left the room briefly before I said it. "Are you all right?" Holmes looked at me. A beat passed, slightly too long. "The figure at the crossroads," he said, "when I lost them." He stopped, started again. "There was a moment when I could have. The South Lane is narrow, and I am faster than I appeared to be giving myself credit for. I could perhaps have caught them." He was looking at the window, not at me. I am not entirely certain I tried as hard as I might have. I did not say anything for a moment. "Because of what Rawlins told us last night," I said. "I do not know," Holmes said. Which from Holmes was a very significant thing to say. I genuinely do not know, and I find that, he paused, "well, uncomfortable. It is called having a conscience," I said. "It happens to most people." He gave me a brief sideways look that contained something between irritation and something else. "Yes, well," he said, "it is not particularly helpful at present." He moved back to the window and stood looking out, and I picked up my letter and did not press further. But I thought about what he had said for the rest of the morning. The idea of Sherlock Holmes at a dark crossroads in the Wiltshire dawn, not entirely certain whether his legs had failed him or his certainty had. It seemed to me, if I am honest, the most human thing I had ever known him to do. The reply from Mrs. Hudson arrived at 3 in the afternoon. It was brief. Mrs. Hudson was a woman of practical economy in all things, including telegrams. Flat empty. Landlady says left yesterday morning with luggage. Paid 3 months ahead. No forwarding address given. Asked about India. Landlady says born there, she thought. Parents both Indian. Never mentioned it himself. Holmes read it once, folded it, and handed it to me without a word. I read it. Then I looked up at him. "You a descendant," I said. "A descendant," Holmes said, "not a survivor. A son, perhaps, or a grandson. Someone who grew up with the story, who was given the names, the details, the coins. Perhaps the coins were left to him, or he knew where they were, or had access to records that told him." He stopped, shook his head slightly. "It does not matter precisely how. What matters is that Horace Pemberton, if that is even his name, has been building this for a very long time. Years, perhaps his whole life." He moved to the window again. Outside, the afternoon light was failing early, as it does in October, and the garden was going grey and indistinct. "And now he knows we know," I said. "Yes," Holmes said, "which means tonight will not be another quiet observation from the east wall." He turned from the window, and his expression was decided now. The complicated thing had settled, or been set aside, or been converted into the clean forward direction that action requires. Tonight will be something else. He was right. It was the weight of old sins. We prepared for the evening with the quiet efficiency of men who understand that preparation is the only honest response to uncertainty. Holmes spoke with Hodges in the late afternoon and sent him to position himself at the end of the South Lane with instructions that were specific enough to be useful and vague enough that Hodges would not feel the need to act before Holmes wanted him to. Rawlins, without being asked, produced a small revolver from his desk drawer, checked it with the practiced ease of a military man, and placed it in his coat pocket. He did not make a production of it. I had my own revolver, which I had brought from Baker Street with the instinct of long experience. Holmes characteristically carried nothing. "You should carry something," I told him, not for the first time in our association. "I carry everything I need," he said, which was the answer he always gave, and which was, I had come to accept, probably true. Mrs. Alcott was sent to her sister's house in the village with a story about a family matter that required her presence, which she accepted with the slightly skeptical cooperation of a woman who suspects she is not being told the full truth, but has decided not to make it an issue. The house settled into a different quality of quiet after she left, emptier, more alert. Holmes arranged the lamps carefully. One left burning in the study, visible from the garden, one in the upstairs hallway, and the rest dark. The effect from outside would be of a house that had retired for the evening, but not entirely. A house that appeared, if you were watching from the east wall, to have grown comfortable and unwary. We settled in to wait. Rawlins and I were in the study. Holmes was somewhere else. He had moved through the dark house with that particular self-sufficiency of his, and stationed himself in a position he did not share with us, which I had given up arguing about some years ago. The Colonel sat in his reading chair without reading, hands on the armrests, looking at the lamp on the desk with the patience of a man accustomed to long waits in difficult conditions. I sat across from him and found myself looking at the coin, still on its square of dark cloth on the corner of the desk, where Rawlins had moved it from under the handkerchief and left it in plain view. It sat there with the quiet, inert significance of an object that has accumulated meaning far beyond its physical substance. A small disc of copper, worth almost nothing, that had crossed 45 years and several thousand miles to sit on a Wiltshire desk and mean something that took far longer to explain than its size suggested. "May I ask you something?" I said, to break the silence, and because I genuinely wanted to know. Rawlins looked at me. "Go ahead." "The coins," I said. "You made them as a record. You said it seemed important that there be some record, even among yourselves. But then you spent 45 years, as far as I can tell, not speaking of it. Not to anyone, or very nearly." I paused. What was the record for, if no one was meant to see it? Rawlins was quiet for a moment. He looked at the coin. "For ourselves," he said, "that is the honest answer. We knew what we had done. The coin was—" he paused, searching for it, a way of saying to ourselves that we knew, that we were not pretending we did not know. He folded his hands in his lap. Whether that is admirable, or simply another form of cowardice, I have never been entirely certain. You can tell yourself you are keeping a record because honesty demands it. You can also tell yourself that because it is easier than actually doing something with the knowledge. Like reporting it. "Like reporting it," he agreed. "Yes." The lamp flickered slightly as a draught moved through the room. Outside, the Wiltshire dark was thorough and deep, the kind of dark that London never quite manages, always diluted by gas lamps and the reflected glow of the city. Here it was complete. "Arthur Vane reported it to no one either," I said, "but what he chose was very different from the rest of you." "Arthur was always different," Rawlins said. "He was the youngest. 24, I think, in 1857. He had been in India less than a year. The rest of us had accommodated ourselves in various ways to the particular moral mathematics of the situation. The things you tell yourself when you are part of a system, and the system asks things of you." He paused. Arthur had not yet learned to do that. I'm not sure if that is a credit to him or simply a matter of timing. He said it without self-pity, which made it more affecting rather than less. I did not have a response to that, so I said nothing. It was just past midnight when we heard it. Not the east gate this time. The sound came from the back of the house, the kitchen, or the passage beside it. A very careful sound, the kind made by someone who has thought about how to move quietly through an unfamiliar space, and has thought about it well, but not perfectly. There is always something in my experience. A board, a latch, the particular acoustic quality of an empty house that carries small sounds differently than an occupied one. Rawlins and I were on our feet before the sound had finished. I had my revolver. Rawlins had his hand in his coat pocket. We looked at each other across the lamplight, and he gave me a small, composed nod. We moved to the study doorway and waited. The sound came closer, through the kitchen, into the back hallway. Slow, deliberate, pausing, occasionally. The pauses were the most unnerving part, because they meant whoever it was had composure enough to stop and listen, to check and recheck, rather than simply moving in haste. And then Holmes's voice came from the darkness of the back hallway, not loud, but very clear. "Mr. Pemberton," he said, "I think that is far enough." A silence, complete and absolute. Then, quietly, from the dark hallway, a voice said, "You knew I would come back." "I expected it," Holmes said. "Come into the light, please. I would prefer this conversation to happen where we can see each other." Another pause, longer this time. And then a figure stepped into the lamplight of the doorway. Horace Pemberton looked different than he had in his Bloomsbury flat. The broad, slow-moving quality I had attributed to age was still there, but it sat differently now, less like the natural movement of an old man and more like a deliberate management of his body by someone who had learned, over a long time, how to appear to be something he was not. He was not as old as he had seemed. 60s, certainly, but the lines in his face owed something to expression and experience as much as to years. He was not carrying anything visible. His hands were at his sides. His eyes moved from Holmes to me to Rawlins, and when they reached Rawlins they stopped. There was a quality to that look that I will not pretend I can fully describe. It was not hatred, which is what I had expected and perhaps prepared for. It was something far more complicated, the look of a man arriving at the end of a very long road who is not entirely sure what he feels now that he has arrived. "Oh, Colonel Rawlins," he said. "Mr. Pemberton," Rawlins said. His voice was steady. "Oh, that is not your name." "No," Pemberton said, "it is not." He looked at Holmes. "How much do you know?" "Enough," Holmes said. He was leaning against the doorframe of the back hallway with his arms loosely crossed, which is a posture I have come to recognize as his version of ease, when ease is being used strategically. Present, calm, non-threatening. "Your mother's father was Maharaj Singh." Something moved in Pemberton's face. Not surprise. Something more like the particular feeling of hearing a name spoken aloud by someone outside the family for the first time. "Yes," he said quietly. "Your mother was born before 1857. She was a child when her father was killed. She came to England, I am guessing, but I believe I am right, with one of the officers' families. Perhaps as a servant, perhaps in some other capacity. She raised you here, in England, with his name and his story and—" Holmes paused. "His coins?" Pemberton was quiet for a moment. "6 coins, he said. "She had all 6. She never told me how. I did not ask eventually, because I understood that some things are held and not explained." He looked at his hands briefly. "She died when I was 19. She made me promise to remember. I promised. And then you spent the next, 40 years, building the knowledge of where they all were," Holmes said. The Indian civil service gave you access. Records, connections, the kind of quiet bureaucratic visibility that lets a patient man find things out without appearing to look. 41 years, Pemberton said. It was not a correction exactly. More like a clarification of scale. The room was very quiet. Holmes looked at him steadily. "Vane," he said. "Arthur Vane, you killed him." Pemberton's jaw tightened. "I found him 18 months ago. I had been looking for him since the others, since the earlier ones. He was the hardest to find because he had done what I had done in a way. He had made himself no one." He paused. "When I found him, I watched him for 6 weeks. I went to his corner. I gave him money sometimes. He did not know who I was." He stopped again, and something crossed his face that was difficult to watch. He was not what I expected. The others, Bryson, Osgood, I went to them first. I let them know I knew. I sent letters. I made certain they understood that someone remembered. Bryson. He paused. Bryson's death was an accident. I want to say that plainly. We argued at the river. I did not. It was not planned. And Osgood, Holmes said. A longer pause. Osgood was not an accident. Holmes did not change expression. And Vane. Pemberton looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked up, his face had a quality I recognized from Rawlins the night before. The look of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has arrived finally at the place where he is going to put it down. Vane asked me, he said, in the end. The room was very still. I began. He knew who I was, Pemberton said. Not at first, but toward the end, I think. I think he had worked it out. He was an intelligent man, and he had been watching the world from that corner for years. Is people who watch for long enough see things. He swallowed. 3 nights before he died, he said to me, "Are you Maharaj's boy?" He used the word boy, as if my grandfather was still alive and I was still a child. He stopped. I told him yes. He was quiet for a very long time, and then he said, "I have been waiting." I told him that was a strange thing to say. He said, "Not really." The silence that followed this was not an empty one. It was full of something none of us in that room seemed inclined to put words to. "He gave me his coin," Pemberton said. He had kept it all those years, sewn into his coat. He took it out and gave it to me and said, "Put it back where it belongs when it is done." I did not entirely know what he meant. He paused, and for the first time since he had stepped into the lamplight, his composure shifted, just slightly, like a wall that has held for a long time and is now showing a single crack. I did not intend to kill him. I went back the next night, and we talked again, and the night after. And on the 3rd night, he was very cold, and he asked me, directly. He said, "Will you help me?" And I understood what he was asking. He stopped. Holmes was looking at him with an expression I could not read at all. Not the clinical assessment look, not the sharp focus of active deduction. Something quieter and less defined. "And the coin over his eye," Holmes said finally. That was what he meant by putting it back. He said his grandfather, the Indian officer, Maharaj Singh, he said in his tradition, the dead are given something to carry with them, something for the crossing. Pemberton looked at the coin on Rawlins's desk. He wanted his coin given back to Maharaj Singh. He said he had been trying to return it for 45 years, and this was the only way left to him. The clock on the mantelpiece continued its patient, indifferent marking of time. Rawlins, who had not spoken since the conversation began, made a sound, not quite a word, but the sound a man makes when something hits him somewhere he did not expect. Holmes moved first. He straightened from the doorframe and said, in a tone that was entirely practical and gave nothing away of whatever had been happening behind his eyes for the last 10 minutes. "Mr. Pemberton, whatever your name is, you have admitted to the killing of at least one man and the probable killing of another. I am not in a position to ignore that, whatever the circumstances." Pemberton nodded. He had, I thought, expected this. "I know." "Hodges is at the end of the South Lane," Holmes said. "I am going to call him. You will go with him peaceably." "Yes." Holmes looked at him for a moment longer. Then he said, with a quietness that was not his usual quietness, "The coin on the doorstep. Rawlins's coin. You are not going to kill him." It was not a question. Pemberton looked at Rawlins. "No," he said, "I wanted him to know that I knew. He paused. "I wanted him to have to sit with it, the way my mother sat with it, the way I have sat with it." He was quiet for a moment. I think I had run out of certainty by the time I reached him. The others, I told myself, I knew what justice required. By the time I came to Wiltshire, I was no longer certain I knew anything. Rawlins said from his chair, "What is your name? Your real name?" Pemberton, the man who had been Pemberton, looked at him. "Arjun Singh," he said. "My mother named me for her father." Rawlins absorbed this. His hands on the armrests of his chair tightened slightly, then released. "Arjun," he said, as if testing the weight of it. "I am sorry," he said. I know it is not enough. I have known for a very long time that there is no enough, but I am sorry." Arjun Singh looked at the old soldier for a long moment. His expression was not forgiveness. I do not think it was that. And I would not want to describe it as something it was not. But it was something. Something that had not been there when he stepped into the lamplight. "I know you are," he said quietly. Holmes went to the end of the South Lane and returned with Hodges, who handled the practicalities with a professionalism that spoke well of him. Arjun Singh went without resistance, without drama. At the door, he paused and looked back once. Not at Holmes, not at me. At the coin on Rawlins's desk. Then he went out into the Wiltshire dark. Rawlins sat in his chair for a long time after they had gone. Holmes and I stayed. It seemed wrong to leave immediately. We sat in the study, and the clock ticked and the lamp burned, and nobody said very much. Holmes was in the other armchair with his fingers pressed together in that particular way of his, looking at the middle distance. He was not doing the intense internal calculation I was used to seeing. He was doing something quieter and less defined. I did not to interrupt it. At some point, Rawlins said, to no one in particular, 45 years. Neither Holmes nor I responded. There was nothing to add to it. After another long silence, Holmes said, very quietly, "The coin." Rawlins looked at him. He did not take it, Holmes said. His grandfather's name was in Vane's coat. Vane gave him the coin to return it, but he did not take the one from your doorstep. Rawlins looked at the coin on his desk for a moment. Then he picked it up, turned it over once in his old fingers, the way Holmes had turned it in his when he had first examined it. He looked at it for a long time. "No," he said, "he left it for me." He set it back down on the cloth. "I think," he said slowly, "that I will write something down. Everything. What happened at Mirabad, what the order was, and who gave it, and what was done. The full account." He looked at Holmes. "It will not change anything." "No," Holmes agreed. "It will not change anything." "But it should exist," Rawlins said. "Somewhere. Someone should have it." Holmes looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said, "someone should." We took the morning train back to London. Holmes was quiet for most of the journey, which was not unusual. Somewhere past Swindon, he said without looking up from the window, "There are cases that resolve, and there are cases that conclude. Those are not always the same thing." I thought about that for a while. "Which is this one?" He considered it. Both, I think, and neither, a little. I looked out at the countryside going past, the fields, the grey sky, of the occasional farm buildings standing solid and indifferent in the October light, and found I did not have anything to add to that. We arrived at Paddington just after noon. London received us with its usual indifference. The noise and press of it, the smell of coal and horses and wet stone. Mrs. Hudson had left lunch on the table, which we ate without much conversation. Holmes picked up his violin afterward and played for a while, not anything I recognized, just something quiet and wandering that seemed to be working something out in a medium that did not require words. I wrote the case up that evening. I have written up many of Holmes's cases, and I have become reasonably practiced at finding the shape of them. The beginning, the turn, the resolution, the lesson that the whole thing resolves into by the end. But most cases have those things. They have a shape that holds. This one was harder to write, not because anything was unclear. Everything was, in the end, clear enough. A dead man who had chosen his death in a manner of speaking. A family's grief that had lasted 2 generations and found, finally, a form. Old men and old sins and the very long patience of history. What was hard to write was the part where all of that simply sits in the room and no one has a sufficient response to it. Holmes had come close, I thought, at the crossroads in the dark. That moment of not quite pursuing, not quite choosing, not quite knowing what certainty required. It was the most honest thing the case produced, perhaps. More honest than the evidence, more honest than the deductions. Just a man standing at a crossroads in the dark, not entirely sure whether justice was ahead of him or behind. I wrote it as best I could. I do not know that I got it right. Some cases you do not get entirely right. You set them down as honestly as you can, and you leave the parts you cannot resolve in plain sight, rather than tidying them away. And you hope the reader will understand that the untidy parts are not failures of the account, but simply the truth of the thing as it was. The copper coin sat on Holmes's desk for 3 days after we returned. On the 4th morning, it was gone. I did not ask where. He did not say. I think we both understood that some things are held and not explained. And that is perhaps enough. And there it is, the adventure of the copper coin. A dead man in a Whitechapel alley. A coin that should not have existed. A secret buried 45 years deep in the soil of a forgotten war. And a man who spent his entire life deciding what to do with a story that was never his to carry and never the his to put down. I will not tell you what to feel about it. The best stories never do. They hand you the pieces and trust you to sit with them honestly. Some of you will feel the weight of what Rawlins carried. Some of you will understand in some quiet part of yourselves why a young man named Arjun Singh made the choices he made. Some of you will think about Arthur Vane, a man who chose to become no one, rather than continue being someone who had done what he had done. And you will not quite be able to let that go. Good. You should not quite be able to let it go. That is what this kind of story is for. Holmes once said, not in this case, but in another, in a different room on a different evening, that London is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. I have always thought he meant that as a remark about crime. But I have come to think over the years that he meant something wider than that. He meant history. He meant the lives underneath the lives people show the world. He meant the coin under the handkerchief, the name sewn into the coat lining, the person standing at the crossroads in the dark, not quite certain what justice looks like from the inside. we observe so little of what is actually there. This story asked us, I hope, to observe a little more carefully. Thank you for reading. Genuinely, in a world that moves very fast and offers endless reasons not to sit with something long enough to feel it, the fact that you stayed all the way to the end means something. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it is still sitting quietly in the back of your mind, then it did what it was meant to do. Until next time.